Susan Holt had always valued her privacy. After years of working in corporate finance, she had finally saved enough to move out of the chaos of city life and settle into a quiet suburban neighborhood where she could enjoy the kind of solitude that had once felt unattainable. Her new home was everything she had ever wanted: spacious but not excessive, with a well-maintained yard, a private driveway, and a sense of security that came from knowing that her property was hers alone. It wasn't just a house, it was a carefully chosen sanctuary, a place where she could finally breathe without the noise of others pressing in on her. The world had taught her long ago that peace was something one had to carve out for oneself, and she had done just that. For the first few months, life in the neighborhood was pleasant enough. She kept to herself, exchanging polite nods with the people on her street, but never feeling the need to integrate into the local social circles. She had no desire to be part of the endless small talk and artificial friendships that some suburban communities seem to thrive on. Susan was not the type to host dinner parties or join the neighborhood book club. She was content with her own company, her evening walks, and the satisfaction of maintaining her home exactly as she liked it. Then there was Karen Wells. Susan had noticed her on the very first day she moved in, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, with platinum-dyed hair and an expression that hovered somewhere between forced warmth and quiet calculation. Karen lived 2 houses down, in a home that was notably larger than the others on the block, a house that exuded an air of self-importance much like its owner. She had introduced herself immediately, appearing at Susan's doorstep within hours of the moving trucks departing, carrying a basket of muffins that looked store-bought but had been carefully arranged to suggest they were homemade. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear," she had said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I make it a point to greet all the new homeowners personally." Susan had thanked her, accepting the basket out of politeness, though something about the woman put her on edge. There was an unspoken authority in Karen's tone, as if she considered herself more than just a friendly neighbor, as if she believed she had some kind of influence over the street itself. It wasn't long before Susan began to notice the peculiar way Karen moved through the neighborhood, the way she lingered outside certain houses, the way other residents seemed to defer to her in conversation. It became increasingly clear that Karen was the type of woman who thrived on control, the self-appointed matriarch of the community, the kind of person who always knew everyone's business and made sure they knew she knew. Susan had seen people like her before, the ones who carried themselves as though the rules applied differently to them, the ones who spoke in polite suggestions that were, in reality, thinly veiled demands. For a while, there were only minor interactions. Karen would wave as she passed by, sometimes stopping to chat about insignificant things: garbage collection schedules, lawn maintenance, the importance of keeping the neighborhood in harmony. Susan would nod along, responding just enough to be polite but never engaging more than necessary. She could sense Karen probing, trying to gauge what kind of person she was dealing with. Was Susan someone who could be influenced, controlled, manipulated into seeing things the way Karen saw them? Then came the driveway issue. Susan's property included a long private driveway that led up to her house, separate from the main road. It was a key reason she had chosen this home. It allowed her to have a clear boundary between herself and the rest of the world. The driveway was clearly marked on her property deed, a part of her land that she had every legal right to control. Yet, from the moment she moved in, she noticed that Karen frequently used it as a shortcut. At first, it was small things. Karen would cut through the driveway on her evening walks, sometimes pausing to admire Susan's garden as though she had every right to be there. Then it escalated. On multiple occasions, Susan spotted Karen's car rolling through her driveway rather than taking the longer route around the street. Once she even saw Karen's daughter, a woman in her late 30s, park her SUV on Susan's property for several hours without asking permission. Susan addressed it directly the first time she saw Karen casually strolling across her driveway. "Karen," she had called out, her tone firm but still polite, "I'd appreciate it if you could use the street instead of my driveway. It's private property." Karen had stopped mid-step, tilting her head as though the request genuinely confused her. "Oh dear, I didn't think you'd mind," she said with a light laugh. "Everyone around here is just so used to it. It's been like this for years. You know how it is, habit and all that." Susan didn't smile. "I do mind." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, the warmth in her eyes cooling by several degrees. "Well," she said after a pause, "I suppose I can try to remember." She didn't. The next time Susan found a car parked on her property, she didn't bother knocking on Karen's door. She called a towing service. By the time Karen came rushing out in her slippers, the tow truck had already hooked the vehicle. "This is completely unnecessary," Karen seethed. "You could have just asked me to move it." "I did," Susan replied calmly. "You ignored me." Karen's eyes flashed with something darker, something deeper than mere annoyance. That was the moment Susan knew the woman would not forget this. And she didn't. The next morning, Susan woke up to find a handwritten note stuck to her mailbox. "You might be new here, but that doesn't mean you can change the way things have always been. This neighborhood works because we respect each other. I suggest you reconsider your approach." It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. Susan stared at the note for a long moment before calmly folding it and slipping it into her pocket. She wasn't easily intimidated. She had dealt with controlling personalities before, people who mistook stubbornness for power. The difference was, this time, it wasn't happening in an office. It was happening in her own home. That was when she decided to install a gate at the entrance of her driveway. If people refused to respect boundaries, then she would create one that they couldn't ignore. The gate was installed within the week, a sleek, automated system with a sturdy lock that ensured no one could use the driveway unless she allowed it. Susan stood by her window, watching as Karen arrived home that evening. The woman stopped in the street, staring at the new gate with an expression that was impossible to decipher. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked directly at Susan's window, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a promise. A promise that the real battle had just begun. Susan barely had time to enjoy the sense of security her new gate provided before the first wave of retaliation hit. It started early the next morning when she was jolted awake by the sound of loud knocking at her front door. The kind of knocking that wasn't just insistent, it was demanding. She threw on a robe, still groggy, and made her way downstairs, her body already tensing as she opened the door to find two uniformed police officers standing on her porch. One was middle-aged, heavy-set, with the kind of face that suggested he had seen it all and was tired of most of it. The other was younger, lean, his posture rigid as though still adjusting to the authority the badge gave him. Behind them, standing just far enough back to feign innocence, was Karen. "Ma'am, are you the owner of this property?" the older officer asked, his tone neutral but firm. Susan tightened her robe around herself. "Yes, what's going on?" The younger officer glanced at Karen before speaking, as if waiting for some silent confirmation before proceeding. "We received a complaint about an illegal obstruction. Your neighbor claims you've blocked access to a shared roadway." Susan felt irritation flare in her chest, but kept her voice calm. "This is my driveway. It's on my property. I had a gate installed to prevent trespassing." Karen stepped forward then, her voice carrying that infuriating blend of condescension and false concern. "Officer, this driveway has been used by the neighborhood for years. Everyone knows it as a community access point. She's only lived here for a few months. She doesn't understand how things work around here." Susan turned her head slowly, meeting Karen's gaze with a cold stare. "I understand just fine. I also understand property law. This is my land, and I don't owe anyone access to it." The older officer sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, as if he had already regretted being dragged into this nonsense. "Look, ma'am, we're not here to start a legal debate. We're just trying to de-escalate a neighbor dispute before it gets out of hand. Your neighbor here says this gate is preventing her from reaching her home conveniently. Maybe there's a compromise." "No," Susan said flatly. "There isn't." The younger officer shifted on his feet. "Are you sure this gate is even allowed? Did you get the proper permits?" Susan folded her arms. "Yes, everything is legal and documented. If you'd like, I can show you the paperwork." There was a brief pause before the older officer exhaled heavily, clearly wishing he had taken a different call this morning. "All right, ma'am, if that's the case, then there's nothing we can do here. It's a civil matter, not a criminal one." Karen let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You're seriously not going to do anything?" The older officer turned to her. "Ma'am, if the property is legally hers, then she has the right to put up a gate. If you believe otherwise, you'll need to take it up in civil court." Karen's eyes flickered with something dark before she quickly smoothed her expression into one of wounded disbelief. "This is how it starts," she muttered, just loud enough for them to hear. "One person decides the rules don't apply to them, and suddenly the whole neighborhood suffers." Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. The only person suffering is the one who refuses to respect boundaries. The officers exchanged glances before the older one cleared his throat. "All right, I think we're done here. Ma'am, if anything escalates, you can always call us. Same goes for you," he added, looking at Karen. Susan watched as Karen gave a tight-lipped smile, but her eyes remained unreadable. As soon as the officers left, she turned on her heel and strode away without another word. Susan didn't trust that silence. It was the kind of silence that promised more trouble, and she was right. Later that afternoon, an official-looking envelope appeared in her mailbox. The return address belonged to the neighborhood association. Susan opened it, already suspecting what was coming. The letter was short and bureaucratic, filled with passive-aggressive phrasing that barely concealed its intent. She was being fined for creating an obstruction that disrupted the harmony of the community. The fine was a ridiculous amount, hundreds of dollars, and at the bottom of the letter was a notice that if she did not comply, further action would be taken. Susan exhaled slowly, running a finger over the sharp crease in the paper. She had expected pushback, but not this quickly, and not with this level of coordination. It was one thing to deal with Karen's entitled behavior. It was another to have a whole association suddenly inserting itself into the situation as if they had a say in her private property. Rather than respond with anger, she did what she always did when faced with a problem. She gathered her facts. She spent the next several hours combing through legal documents, zoning laws, and any regulations regarding private driveways and homeowner rights. The more she read, the more she realized that the fine had no legal standing. They had no authority to tell her what to do with her own land. So the next morning she responded accordingly. She sent a formal letter back to the association, citing the specific legal codes that rendered their fine invalid. She included copies of her property deed, the permit for the gate, and a request for written documentation proving their authority over her land. Then she waited. Days passed without a response, but the silence didn't bring peace. It brought escalation. First, there were the whispers. Neighbors who had once simply ignored her now looked at her differently. Conversations would halt when she walked past. A few people even went as far as shaking their heads in disapproval as if she had committed some great social offense. Then there were the small acts of pettiness. Her garbage cans were suddenly knocked over in the mornings, even though the wind hadn't been strong enough to move them. A sprinkler head in her front yard mysteriously broke, flooding part of her lawn. The mail she had been expecting arrived late or not at all. One night, she heard something outside, footsteps crunching over gravel. She peered through the blinds just in time to see a figure disappearing into the darkness, a shadowy blur moving too quickly for her to identify. But she could still make out what they had done. Her gate had been vandalized. A thick, red streak of paint had been smeared across the metal, the words "not yours" standing out in dripping, uneven letters. Susan didn't react with fear. She didn't panic or call the police, because she already knew how that would go. Instead, she methodically took photos of the damage, documented everything, and scheduled a professional cleaning service to remove the paint. And then, she reinforced the gate with a security system. The moment Karen saw the new camera mounted above the entrance, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "Ah, now we're really playing." Susan had never been one to back down. But as she locked the gate that night, checking the new reinforced bolts, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just dealing with an entitled neighbor anymore. She was dealing with someone who truly believed she was in the right. And that made her dangerous. Susan had expected the conflict with Karen to die down after the security system was installed. Most people, when confronted with real consequences, backed off. They didn't like being watched, didn't like the idea that their actions could be recorded and used against them. A rational person would have realized that Susan wasn't the type to roll over and allow herself to be bullied out of her own property. But Karen wasn't rational, at least not in the way that normal people were. She operated on an entirely different set of rules, ones where logic and legality were secondary to whatever personal sense of authority she had crafted for herself over the years. The first real sign that things were about to get worse came in the form of another letter from the neighborhood association. This one was more aggressive than the last, carefully worded to sound official while still being vague enough to keep their hands clean of any real legal threats. They were now claiming that Susan's gate had negatively impacted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood and was in violation of unwritten community standards. There was no mention of actual bylaws, no direct citation of any rules that she had broken, just a thinly veiled warning that she was stepping out of line. The letter concluded with an invitation, though it was more of a summons, to a community meeting where the issue would be discussed. Susan didn't respond. She didn't show up to the meeting either. She had no interest in entertaining the self-important opinions of people who had no legal claim over her property, but ignoring them didn't make them go away. If anything, it only made them angrier. 2 days later, Susan woke up to find that her trash hadn't been collected. The bins were still at the curb, untouched, while every other house on the street had been serviced. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but when she called the waste management company, the woman on the other end of the line hesitated before telling her, in a voice that sounded far too rehearsed, that there had been complaints about improper disposal at her address. When Susan asked what that meant, the woman could only stammer something about policy violations before apologizing and hanging up. It didn't take long to figure out what had happened. Karen had influence in this neighborhood, far more than Susan had initially realized, and she was using it. It wasn't just about the driveway anymore. It was about control, about making an example out of Susan, so that no one else got the idea that they could push back against the unwritten hierarchy that had clearly existed here long before she had arrived. That afternoon, she caught Karen standing near the curb in front of her house, chatting idly with another neighbor. She was speaking just loudly enough for Susan to hear from her porch. "It's such a shame," Karen said, shaking her head with exaggerated sympathy, "when people move in and just don't understand the values we uphold here. It really disrupts the sense of community." The other neighbor, an older man who had barely acknowledged Susan's existence before now, nodded solemnly. "Some people just aren't a good fit." Susan didn't take the bait. She had spent too many years dealing with corporate sharks to be rattled by a woman who thought passive aggression was a form of high strategy. Instead, she took a slow sip of her coffee, met Karen's eyes from across the lawn, and smiled. Not the kind of smile that suggested friendliness or reconciliation, but the kind that said, "I see exactly what you're doing, and I'm not impressed." Karen's expression didn't falter, but Susan could see the flicker of irritation behind her practiced facade. That night, Susan decided to reinforce her home security. She upgraded the locks on her doors and double-checked the perimeter cameras. The footage from the previous nights hadn't shown anything unusual, but that didn't mean nothing had happened. She had the growing sense that Karen wasn't done. She was right. The next morning, as Susan walked outside to grab the newspaper, she stopped short. There, sitting right in the middle of her driveway, was a dead rat. Its body was twisted unnaturally, its fur matted with blood, and its throat had been slit with disturbing precision. Susan stared at it for a long moment, then slowly lifted her gaze to Karen's house. The curtains in the front window twitched slightly. For the first time, a chill ran down Susan's spine. This was different. This wasn't just petty neighborhood politics or passive-aggressive sabotage. This was a message. She took a breath, steadying herself, then walked back inside. Instead of calling the police, she grabbed a pair of gloves, picked up the rat, and disposed of it herself. She wasn't going to give Karen the satisfaction of a reaction. If she wanted to escalate things, she would have to do better than a dead animal. But Karen did do better. A few nights later, Susan woke up to the sound of something scratching against metal. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as she lay still, listening, it became clearer. Someone was at the gate. She moved quickly, slipping out of bed and making her way to the front of the house, careful to stay in the shadows. Through the window, she could see a dark figure crouched near the gate's lock, their hands moving deliberately as they worked at something. Susan grabbed her phone and turned on the security feed. The night vision camera captured the figure in crisp detail. It wasn't Karen. It was a man tall and lean, wearing dark clothing and gloves. He wasn't just trying to break the lock. He was installing something. A cold knot formed in Susan's stomach as she watched. She stepped back from the window and did something she had never done before. She retrieved the firearm she kept locked in a safe in her bedroom. She had never needed to use it, never even entertained the thought of having to defend herself like this. But something about the way that man was working at her gate, something about the calm, practiced nature of his actions, told her that whatever he was doing, it wasn't random. She didn't open the door. She didn't rush outside like some reckless horror movie character demanding to know what was going on. Instead, she called the police. This time, when the officers arrived, they took her seriously. By the time they reached the gate, the man was gone, but the security footage gave them a clear look at his face. The next day, Susan received another letter. This one wasn't from the association. It was slipped under her door, a single sheet of paper with only a few words scrawled in precise, almost mechanical handwriting. Some fights aren't worth winning. Susan read it twice before tearing it in half. She didn't know who that man was. She didn't know what he had been doing to her gate, but she knew one thing. Karen wasn't just some entitled neighbor with a superiority complex. She was connected to something bigger. And Susan had just become more than an inconvenience. She had become a target. Susan had never considered herself the paranoid type. She was logical, practical, someone who assessed risks and acted accordingly. But as she stood at her front window, staring at the empty street where the man had stood just hours ago, she felt something shift inside her. The note left under her door wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. It didn't say anything explicit, didn't contain the usual hallmarks of intimidation. But that was what made it worse. It was the kind of message that didn't need to scream to be understood. Some fights aren't worth winning. It wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. She spent the rest of the night reviewing her security footage, pausing and rewinding the video, studying the man's movements in microscopic detail. He had approached the gate without hesitation, moving with the kind of practiced ease that suggested he had done something like this before. He hadn't fumbled with tools, hadn't acted like an amateur trying to pick a lock. Instead, he had installed a small, almost imperceptible device near the base of the gate, hidden in the shadows where the cameras wouldn't easily catch it. She had retrieved it after the police left, prying it loose with careful hands, half expecting it to explode in her grip. It was small, black, about the size of a matchbox, with no branding, no serial number, nothing to indicate where it had come from or what it was meant to do. It had taken her less than 5 minutes of research to identify it. A GPS tracker. Someone wanted to know when she left, when she came back, how often she used the gate. She didn't call the police again. She already knew how that conversation would go. The officers had been helpful the first time, taking the footage and promising to investigate, but she could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they filed her case under strange but not urgent. They didn't understand that this wasn't a simple case of vandalism or trespassing. This was calculated. And it all came back to Karen. Susan had spent weeks brushing off her neighbor's behavior as petty power plays, the desperate attempts of a woman clinging to control. But now the pieces were shifting into something more deliberate, something deeper. Karen wasn't just angry about the gate. She wasn't just retaliating out of spite. She had called the police, mobilized the neighborhood association, manipulated local services against Susan, and now someone had been sent to track her movements. What had she actually stumbled into? Susan didn't go outside the next morning. She waited, watching the street from behind her curtains, observing the usual rhythms of the neighborhood, the joggers, the dog walkers, the early commuters. Karen. She moved as she always did, pausing by Susan's driveway just long enough to remind her that she belonged there, that Susan's attempts to keep her out were nothing more than an inconvenience. She smiled when she saw Susan's car still in the driveway, her expression filled with the kind of quiet triumph that made Susan's skin crawl. Susan spent the day researching. She dug into public records, property histories, Anything that might explain why Karen was so fixated on this house, this driveway. It wasn't just nostalgia or routine. There was something about the land itself, something about the way Karen spoke of it with entitlement rather than familiarity. The records told a story. The house had changed hands multiple times over the past few decades, more than was typical for a property in such a desirable neighborhood. Most owners had only stayed a few years before selling, always under vague circumstances. The sales agreements were clean, no reported disputes, no lawsuits or pending investigations, but Susan recognized patterns when she saw them. This house was a stepping stone for its previous owners, never a permanent home. And in every transfer of ownership, there was one constant. Karen Wells had lived on this street before the house was even built. The land itself had belonged to a previous development company, one that had quietly dissolved in the mid-90s, its assets divided and sold off in pieces. Karen had been one of the first buyers in the newly established neighborhood, one of the original residents before zoning laws shifted and new properties were added, which meant Susan exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening on the edges of the documents. Karen had lived here before the house. Before the road was paved, before the property lines were redrawn, she had once owned all of this land. And she clearly still believed, deep down, that it belonged to her. Susan sat back, rubbing a hand over her face. This wasn't about rules or neighborhood traditions. It wasn't even about access to the driveway. It was about ownership. Karen had spent decades watching houses rise on land she once called hers, had spent years molding the neighborhood into something that still reflected her authority. And then Susan had arrived, shutting her out, erasing that control with one locked gate. No wonder she had reacted the way she did. No wonder she had escalated. Susan looked at the GPS tracker still sitting on her desk. The message it sent was clear. She had disrupted something Karen believed was hers, and now Karen was making sure she knew the cost of defiance. But there was one thing Susan still didn't understand. Who was the man at the gate? Karen wasn't stupid. She was manipulative, passive-aggressive, someone who wielded influence through whispers and pressure rather than direct force. But hiring someone to trespass onto private property, to plant a tracking device that wasn't neighborhood politics anymore. That was something else. Susan needed more information. That night, she did something she never thought she'd do. She left her security cameras on, set an alert for motion detection, and walked straight to Karen's front door. Karen answered almost immediately, as if she had been expecting her. "My dear," she said, smiling too wide. "How lovely of you to stop by." Susan didn't return the smile. "Let's stop pretending this is about the driveway." Karen tilted her head. "Is that what you think?" Susan's voice was steady. "I know the history of this property. I know you were here before the house was even built. I know you think this land still belongs to you." For a flicker of a second, something behind Karen's eyes changed. A shift so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Susan noticed. Then Karen chuckled, shaking her head as if Susan were a child speaking nonsense. "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed. "You think this is about land?" Susan felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Karen leaned in slightly, dropping the act just enough to let something sharp slip through. "You're asking the wrong questions." Susan's breath was steady, but her heart was pounding. "Then what are the right ones?" Karen smiled. "Why do you think no one stays in that house for more than a few years?" Susan didn't move. Karen's voice was soft, almost pitying. "Because eventually they understand." She stepped back, the conversation apparently over, and gently closed the door. Susan stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood, listening to the quiet click of the lock sliding into place. Then she turned and walked home, her mind spinning with one single, undeniable truth. This wasn't about the driveway. It had never been about the driveway. Karen wasn't trying to take something back. She was trying to make Susan leave. Susan barely slept that night. Even as she lay in bed, her body exhausted but her mind racing, she couldn't shake the way Karen had looked at her, the quiet certainty in her voice when she said those final words. Eventually they understand. There was no question anymore this wasn't about the driveway, or the gate, or even some twisted sense of entitlement. Karen wanted Susan gone, and if history was any indication, she had always gotten what she wanted. The next morning, Susan went about her routine as if nothing had changed, but her senses were on high alert. She scanned the street as she stepped outside, noting which cars were parked where, which neighbors lingered just a little too long in their front yards. Every movement felt like it carried hidden meaning. Every glance from a passerby seemed weighted with unspoken knowledge. She wasn't imagining it, she could feel the shift. She had spoken to Karen directly, broken the delicate, unspoken rules of whatever game was being played here. Now, she had to wait for the consequences. They came sooner than expected. It started with the water. Susan had been in the kitchen, rinsing out her coffee mug, when she noticed the weak pressure from the faucet. A few minutes later, the flow reduced to a slow trickle, then stopped altogether. She frowned, twisting the knob back and forth, trying the other sinks in the house, but it was the same everywhere, nothing but dry pipes. She called the water department, expecting to hear about a main break or scheduled maintenance, but the woman on the other end of the line hesitated when she pulled up Susan's address. There was a report filed this morning, she said carefully. A request for service termination. Susan's stomach dropped. What? I didn't file any request. The woman sounded uncomfortable. It came from your property management account. The request was authorized with your name and information. Susan forced herself to stay calm. I don't have a property management account. I own my house. There was silence on the other end. Then a quiet, "Oh." Susan exhaled, gripping the edge of the counter. Can you turn it back on? I'll put in an emergency request, the woman assured her. But this kind of thing usually requires verification. I'd recommend checking with your HOA. Susan closed her eyes, her patience hanging by a thread. I don't have an HOA. Another pause. That's not what's listed on the request. Susan didn't have to ask. She already knew. She ended the call, taking a slow breath before walking to the window. Across the street, Karen was outside, watering her perfect flower beds, humming to herself like nothing in the world could bother her. The water arched from her hose in a steady stream, glistening in the morning sun. Susan's taps were dry. The message was clear. She spent the next hour making calls, proving her identity, demanding the service be restored immediately. But it wasn't just about the inconvenience. Someone had impersonated her, accessed records they shouldn't have been able to reach. This wasn't just pettiness anymore. It was deliberate sabotage. And if they could do this, what else could they manipulate? The answer came the next morning in the form of a certified letter taped to her front door. Notice of property code violation. The language was formal, clinical, filled with legal jargon outlining multiple infractions, unauthorized modifications to property structures, disruptive obstructions, non-compliance with established residential aesthetics. There was a fine, an absurd amount, and a deadline for correction of violations. And at the bottom, neatly typed, was a clause stating that if these issues weren't rectified, the property would be subject to legal review for potential forfeiture. Susan's hands clenched around the paper. This wasn't a fine. It was a warning shot. Karen had influence, more than Susan had anticipated, and she was using it to pull whatever strings were available. It didn't matter that Susan had done nothing illegal, that her gate was fully permitted, that she wasn't bound by any neighborhood regulations. Karen had manufactured a conflict, and now she was pressing it into something bigger, something that could cause real consequences if Susan didn't fight back. But Susan wasn't going to back down. She took the letter inside, documented every page, and spent the next several hours building her case. She contacted the city directly, demanding a review of the claims. She filed a dispute against the fines, citing her legally documented property rights. She sent copies of her deeds, her permits, anything that proved that this was nothing more than a baseless attack. And then she waited. The following evening, she heard voices outside. She turned off her kitchen light, moving silently toward the front window. There, at the edge of her property, stood three figures. One of them she recognized instantly: Karen, standing with her arms folded, her head tilted slightly as if observing something she had orchestrated. The other two were men, both dressed in dark work uniforms, carrying clipboards and tools. They weren't maintenance workers. They were inspectors. Susan's stomach tightened. She stepped outside before they could reach the gate. "Can I help you?" One of the men glanced up from his clipboard. "We received a report about multiple code violations. We're conducting an inspection." Susan's jaw tightened. "A report from whom?" He didn't answer, just gestured toward the letter she had received. "It's a routine check, ma'am." Karen smiled from behind him. "Oh, don't mind us, dear. We just want to make sure everything is up to standard." Susan met her gaze, cold and unwavering. "You don't have the authority to inspect my property." The inspector sighed. "If there's nothing wrong, this won't take long." Susan considered her options. If she refused, they'd claim noncompliance, escalate the fines, push harder. If she let them in, they'd fabricate something, twist minor details into violations just to justify their interference. So she made a choice. She smiled. "Of course." "Let me just call my lawyer first." Karen's expression flickered. Susan pulled out her phone, turning slightly so they could see the screen as she dialed. She didn't have a lawyer, not yet, but they didn't know that. "Hey, Mark," she said, her voice easy, controlled. "Yeah, I've got some city inspectors here, and they want access to my property. Can you get here in the next 15 minutes? The inspector hesitated. Karen's mouth pressed into a thin line. Susan waited. Finally, the man lowered his clipboard. "Will. Return at a later date." Karen's smile had vanished. As they left, Susan felt a slow, steady pulse of satisfaction in her chest. This was a game Karen had played many times before, but she wasn't used to people fighting back, and Susan was just getting started. But as she locked the gate behind her, a quiet dread settled in her stomach. If Karen was willing to go this far, what would she do when she realized intimidation wasn't enough? Susan knew Karen wouldn't take the setback well. The inspectors had left empty-handed, their manufactured violations useless, and Karen had walked away without the satisfaction of watching Susan panic. That wasn't something a person like Karen could tolerate. She had built her influence by making people bend, by ensuring that resistance wasn't just difficult but futile. Susan had done more than push back, she had embarrassed her. She spent the next day watching the neighborhood, waiting for the next move. Her water had been restored, her trash pickup resumed, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she had gained ground instead of losing it. But she also knew that victories like these were temporary. Karen had escalated at every turn, and there was no reason to believe she would stop now. Susan didn't have to wait long. It started just after midnight. She had been in bed, drifting in and out of a restless sleep, when a sound jolted her awake. Not the usual nighttime creaks of the house settling, or the distant hum of traffic, but something closer. A low, scraping noise, metal against metal. She sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. Then silence. Susan slipped out of bed and moved cautiously toward the window, keeping herself in the shadows as she peered outside. The street was empty. The houses dark. But something felt wrong. She checked the security camera feed on her phone, scanning through the different angles. The front gate, the driveway, the backyard. Nothing. And then movement. A figure at the side of the house. Susan froze, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Karen. The shape was wrong, the build too broad. A man. Dressed in dark clothing, hood pulled up, moving with slow, deliberate steps. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't hesitating. He knew exactly where he was going. The camera caught the glint of something metallic in his hand. A crowbar. Susan's pulse thundered in her ears. He wasn't here to send a message. He was here to break in. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911 as she backed away from the window. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost detached as she explained what was happening, but Susan could hear the underlying urgency in her own words. The operator assured her that officers were being dispatched, but Susan knew how this worked. Response times weren't instant. and the man outside wasn't waiting. She heard the first impact a second later. A dull, sickening crack as the crowbar met the side gate, followed by a second hit, then a third. He was trying to break through. Susan had seconds to decide what to do. She could stay inside, wait for the police, hope the lock held. Or she could make sure he didn't get inside at all. Her hands were steady as she grabbed the weapon she had never planned to use. The weight of the pistol was foreign, unfamiliar, but she didn't have time to second-guess herself. She moved through the house, keeping her steps light, her breath controlled. Another impact. A final splintering crack. The gate gave way. Susan positioned herself near the back of the house, just out of sight but close enough to hear the slow creak of the hinges as the intruder stepped through. He was careful, methodical, not rushing. He thought the house was empty. He thought he had time. Susan let him take 3 steps onto her property before she made her presence known. The sound of the slide racking back on the gun was impossibly loud in the quiet night. The man froze. "I have a gun," Susan said, her voice clear, even, "and I will use it." For a long, stretched-out moment, neither of them moved. The tension was suffocating, the air between them charged with unspoken intent. Then, slowly, the man raised his hands, fingers spread in mock surrender. "Easy now," he said, his voice low, smooth. "No need for that." Susan didn't lower the gun. "Turn around. Walk back out the way you came." He smiled, barely visible in the dim light. "You sure about that?" A car engine rumbled in the distance. The police. The man heard it too. His smile faded, his body tensed, and then, without another word, he moved. Not toward her, but away, back through the broken gate, disappearing into the night just as the first patrol car turned onto the street. By the time the officers reached her door, he was gone. They took her statement, checked the footage, searched the perimeter. The man had been careful, no fingerprints, no identifying marks, just a shadow moving through the night with a purpose. The officers asked her the usual questions, if she had any enemies, if she thought this was connected to previous incidents. She didn't mention Karen. She didn't have to. When they left, Susan locked the doors, reinforced the broken gate as best as she could, and sat in the silence of her home, the adrenaline still thrumming through her veins. And then she made a decision. Karen wanted her gone. She wanted Susan to give up, to leave like the others before her. She had tried manipulation, sabotage, intimidation, and now, when those hadn't worked, she had resorted to something worse. Susan wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, as the sun rose over the neighborhood, she walked outside, down her driveway, and straight to Karen's house. She didn't knock. She didn't ask for permission. She stepped onto Karen's porch and met her neighbor's gaze through the front window. Karen opened the door before Susan could speak. "My dear," she said, voice sweet as poisoned honey. "What brings you by so early?" Susan took a slow breath. "I know what you did." Karen tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Whatever do you mean?" Susan's smile was sharp, humorless. "It didn't work." A flicker of something crossed Karen's face. Something she tried to hide but couldn't quite suppress. "I don't know what you're implying," she said smoothly, "but I would be careful making accusations without proof." Susan held her gaze. "You keep pushing people until they break. Until they leave. That's what you do, isn't it?" Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes gleamed with something cold and knowing. "Sometimes people just realize they don't belong." Susan leaned in slightly. "I do." Something passed between them then, an unspoken acknowledgement of the war they were now fully engaged in. Karen had expected her to crumble. Susan had done the opposite. She turned without another word, walking back to her house with her head high, her steps steady. Karen had played her best hand, and Susan was still standing. Susan didn't know what she expected after confronting Karen, but the days that followed were eerily quiet. There were no more letters, no inspectors showing up at her door, no more strange calls to utility companies claiming to be her. The usual subtle acts of sabotage, the knocked over trash cans, the whispered conversations from neighbors that stopped the moment she walked by had all ceased. It was as if Karen had decided to do exactly what Susan had refused to step back. and that was what unsettled her the most. Karen wasn't the kind of person to let things go. She had spent weeks orchestrating every possible method of getting Susan to leave, escalating each time the previous attempt failed. She didn't just give up. The silence felt less like surrender and more like an intermission. Susan carried on as normally as she could, but the feeling of unease never left her. She reinforced her home security, changed the locks, installed additional cameras in areas she hadn't thought necessary before. She stopped leaving her car in the driveway, keeping it safely inside the garage instead. She had seen what Karen was capable of, and she wasn't going to leave herself open to any more surprises. Then, one evening, just as the last light of day faded beyond the trees, a car pulled into Karen's driveway. Susan watched from her window as a man stepped out, dressed in an expensive but understated suit. He moved with precision, his posture too rigid to belong to a casual visitor. Karen met him on the porch, greeting him with a smile that looked forced. The two exchanged quiet words, their voices too low for Susan to hear, but the tension in Karen's shoulders was unmistakable. She wasn't in control of this conversation. She was being spoken to, instructed. The exchange lasted no more than 5 minutes. Then the man turned, walking briskly back to his car, never once looking in Susan's direction. Karen remained on the porch, staring after him long after he had driven away. And then, for the first time since this war had begun, Susan saw something in Karen that she had never seen before. Not arrogance. Not amusement. Fear. It was gone within seconds, replaced by the carefully composed mask Karen always wore, but Susan had seen it. The way her fingers gripped the railing just a little too tightly, the way her throat moved as she swallowed hard, as if forcing herself to regain control. Susan didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about the man, the way Karen had reacted to him. Who was he? Why had he come? And why, after everything Karen had done to drive Susan out, did she now look like she was the one who wanted to disappear? The next morning, something even stranger happened. Karen's car was gone. That in itself wasn't unusual. She left the house often, whether to run errands or simply to make sure her presence was known. But by noon, she still hadn't returned. By evening, her house remained dark, the windows empty, the lights off. Susan stood by her window, watching, waiting for something. But nothing happened. And then, just after sunset, she saw it, a moving truck. It pulled into Karen's driveway silently, efficiently, followed by a black sedan. Several men stepped out, professionals, not the usual friends and family that came with most moves. They worked quickly, methodically, carrying out boxes and carefully wrapped furniture as if every minute counted. Karen wasn't there. Susan's heart pounded as she watched. It wasn't just that Karen was leaving, it was the way it was happening. No formal goodbyes, no neighbors gathering to see her off, no passive-aggressive farewell remarks about how Susan had ruined the neighborhood. Karen had ruled this street for years, thrived off the control she had over it. She wouldn't just leave like this. Not unless she had no other choice. By midnight, the house was empty. The moving truck was gone. The sedan had driven away without ever turning on its headlights. Karen Wells had vanished. No explanation. No final attempt at victory. Just gone. For the first time in months, Susan felt her body truly relax. The tension she had carried with her every day, the expectation of another battle, another attack, another subtle act of sabotage, it was over. But the relief didn't last. 2 days later, a letter arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't from Karen. It wasn't from the association or the city or anyone Susan recognized. The envelope was plain, the paper inside thick and expensive. There was no return address, just a single sentence, neatly typed in the center of the page. You should have left when you had the chance. Susan read the words over and over, the letters burning into her mind. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was a statement of fact. A final, quiet confirmation that Karen wasn't acting alone. That whatever she had been part of, whatever influence she had wielded over the neighborhood, she had answered to someone else, and now Karen was gone. But Susan wasn't. She looked out her window, staring at the empty house across the street. she had won. She had stood her ground. So why didn't it feel like a victory?